Mobility to me is really an enabler. So it's what enables everything. If you think about it, you need to go places to do really pretty much anything, right? In life. And so when the opportunity came up to, of course, work in partnership with the Apple the App Foundation, the Asian Development Bank, we were thrilled to be able to dig deeper into the Philippines market and conduct this research to think about potential models for an EV center of excellence in the Philippines. I think, in terms of takeaways, there are so very many opportunities. Again, I want to highlight there are already very strong players doing important work on e-mobility, but I do believe that there's a role for other players or potential entities that can sort of complement. And that's a key word, right? Complement and support and sort of add value to what's happening there and push e-mobility forward so that as globally the world moves towards energy transition, looking at decarbonizing energy systems, transport electrification, and many other levers and tools that we can use, right? We're referring to a set of principles, values that really try to get to the idea that nobody should be left behind in the transition from a high carbon to a low carbon economy.
Hey, I'm Al, and this is the Paglalayag podcast. I'm using this podcast to showcase what's going on around me in the hardware and clean tech sectors dito sa Philippines. With guests from across the startup, research, investment, and enabler ecosystems, Paglalayag focuses on the stories and inspirations that motivate us to start up in hardware and press on down this arduous path of steering our economy away from the looming climate catastrophe that makes itself increasingly felt in our lives each passing year. I hope you'll find this cast of characters as impressive and inspiring as I do. Also, if you've been listening to these podcasts and want to let me know what you think, there's a survey form available at paglalayag.net-podcast. You can also reach out by email at al@paglalayag.net. I'd love to hear from you. Sige, tuloy-tuloy lang. Let's jump in. All right. So, welcome everybody to Paglalayag. I'm Al, and today I'm joined by Diana Paez, William Davidson Institute Senior Director of Energy and Mobility. So William Davidson Institute, WDI, is coming out of the University of Michigan. And Diana is helping with the energy and mobility businesses and stakeholders for low and middle income countries to take advantage of business opportunities and adapt to changes brought about by the energy transition, with a special focus on what's known as the just transition. Drawing from previous roles at the American Council of Education, the National Democratic Institute, and the World Bank, among others, she brings more than a decade of global development experience working with partners across government, private sector, academia, and civil society. Last month, Diana and her team, WDI, released a report titled Driving a Just Transition to E-Mobility in the Philippines. So WDI has got a bit of a celebrity team together for this one, working with Apple the Apple Foundation, which bears the name of the founder of the Black Eyed Peas, and then also the Asian Development Bank. So I met Diana earlier this year at one of their focus group discussions that they hosted while doing the research for this report. Those of you who've been following the podcast for a while will be familiar with New Energy Nexus. So they had recently, at the time, done a seminar showcasing a number of successful collaborations between innovation hubs and centers of excellence in various regions. Perhaps you've heard my discussion with Doc Al Sarafica about centers of excellence here in the Philippines. So suffice it to say, this is a direction that we at Paglalayag and Sunny see as very important to the success of our own local tech development efforts in the Philippines. So this dovetails very well with our own ecosystem development activities here. So I said the same during our focus group discussion and was pleasantly surprised to learn that the EV Center of Excellence is actually an explicit agenda item for this collaboration that WDI is working on. So I'm very much looking forward to this chat, and thank you very much for joining me, Diana.
Thank you so much, Al. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm looking forward to our conversation, certainly about our work in the Philippines, which has been a terrific learning experience and collaborative experience, as you mentioned, with the celebrity all-star team. But not only us, also a lot of organizations with whom we worked, who are located in the Philippines and doing a lot of work already in this space.
Yeah, definitely. So, Electric Vehicle Association of the Philippines stand out. Did I miss any?
Yeah, Clean Air Asia, since they're also leading the project, the e-mobility ASAP project, and have done a lot of work. So they were a key partner as well in terms of our research for this report and this collaboration with the Asian Development Bank.
Yeah, for
No
the ASAP
worries.
project. So very good. Do you want to maybe just get started with maybe if you've got any like main takeaways from your report and research, and what kind of like some of the biggest parts that stuck out for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean that there's a lot that we can talk about there in terms of the report too. Maybe also I would love to just share a little bit about WDI, if that's okay, just to give
Yeah,
the
sure.
the listeners a little bit of an idea of who we are. So we're a nonprofit, as you mentioned, affiliated with the University of Michigan, based in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And even though we're here, all of our outlook and our work is global. Our vision is to support entrepreneurs and ecosystems in emerging markets. So we focus on low and middle income countries specifically with tools and knowledge, insights, and partnerships to achieve, business success and also contribute to economic growth. So we've been around for 30 years plus and have developed a lot of different partnerships around the world. We're focused on three key areas of energy and mobility, which is the team I lead, climate health, and health. And so we've been lucky to work in the Philippines actually before. Quite a few years ago, we worked on a partnership focused on education and workforce development, and of course, in other places in Asia, in Latin America, and in Africa across different sectors. So just to give a little bit of that overview in terms of who we are and why we're interested in this topic. In terms of e-mobility, I've been focused on that and developed a body of work since 2019, really interested in what enables the transition to e-mobility in low and middle income countries. What are some of the key drivers? What are the barriers as well? And what are those innovations happening along the entire EV value chain? I specifically or especially really, really enjoy uncovering some of those innovations and some of those lessons and trying to develop cross-market insights to support e-mobility transition and accelerate that growth. When the opportunity came up to, of course, work in partnership with the Apple the App Foundation, the Asian Development Bank, we were thrilled to be able to dig deeper into the Philippines market and conduct this research to think about potential models for an EV center of excellence in the Philippines, as you mentioned. And so in our report, we actually take a really broad view of, first and foremost, what's happening in the e-mobility transition at the global level. Then we talk about some of the main key trends in Southeast Asia to kind of, really look at the broader context, because of course, with especially with automotive and EV supply chains being so global, everything is so connected. It matters a lot what's happening not only inside the country, but also outside of the country. And so we looked at global market trends on e-mobility. And then in terms of diving deep into the Philippines, we looked at three key areas: policy framework, the market trends, of course, market dynamics for EVs right now, and then the workforce aspect of e-mobility and the potential needs and opportunities as well to develop the EV talent that will be needed, to support this transition going forward. So the report really provides, I think, so we came out with a report, as you mentioned, based on this research where we synthesize all of our findings. And it provides, I think, a pretty comprehensive view of these three aspects of e-mobility in the Philippines. And then the last kind of section of the report is really kind of taking all of those takeaways or looking at, what is the state of play right now across those three enablers. And then based on that, what could be potential models for an entity, right? An EV center of excellence that could be anchored on the local ecosystem and provide or offer a variety of, services or engage in different areas to support and potentially fill some gaps in terms of accelerating e-mobility transition in the country. So that's more or less how we structure the research. You mentioned a focus group where we had the opportunity to meet. We conducted extensive desk research and, of course, also field work in Manila. That was truly a highlight, and we're able to convene a lot of different stakeholders, including yourself, to get firsthand information and data about some of the needs, some of the concerns, some of the perspectives that go into all of these ecosystem to support e-mobility transition. So maybe I'll stop there, and then I'm happy to delve a little bit deeper into some of the takeaways for each of those areas that we looked at, but in case you have any other questions for now.
Cool. Yeah. So I guess one of the first ones I'll go, because this is one that you sort of had a specific question to see who was familiar with the term at the event, and there were not too many who were. So why don't we hear a little bit about the just transition aspect and how you define that, because it is quite an important part of the approach that you've taken with this research and approach.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm glad you highlight that, Al, because what I kind of covered in terms of how we structure the research and the areas we were looking at for each of those areas, it was the key lens that we applied was just transition and just transition implications. And this is, of course, core to the Asian Development Bank's work. It is critically important for the Apple the App Foundation as well. And we are very, very committed to supporting those principles and to contributing a little bit more to precisely the understanding behind what it means, just transition. What does it mean? What does it mean in the context of e-mobility? What does it mean when we think about and talk about policy design for e-mobility, market trends, like what can private sector do versus governments? And then what does it mean also when we think about workforce training programs for EVs, both in terms of designing, in terms of offering those programs, who is included, who is not, right? So then just to share just at a higher level, so when we talk about just transition, we're referring to set of principles, values that really try to get to the idea that nobody should be left behind in the transition from a high carbon to a low carbon economy. So this is a key principle that, of course, comes into play as globally the world moves towards energy transition, looking at decarbonizing energy systems, transport electrification, and many other levers and tools that we can use, right, to address climate change. And so because of the scale, the magnitude of this transition, this transformation, it means that many of the legacy industries that we've used so far in our system need to transform, right? But as they transform, there are implications for people, for workers, for communities that either depend on these legacy industries for their livelihoods, are contributing or are participating in some way in those value chains, and truly, of course, need to also be able to benefit from the opportunities that the new system that we're working towards will bring and will open up. And so when we think about just transition, it means being intentional about, first and foremost, understanding what the implications are, who might be affected, right? How can we ensure that they are not affected? How can we mitigate those risks and those challenges and implications? And then how can we make sure that they are included and their voices are, heard? So there are different types of principles and very many frameworks in terms of just transition in general, in globally. So there's a lot written and a lot studied there. And what you pointed out is actually very important in that not everybody talks about or recognizes these set of principles as being just transition, right? It's not necessarily a term that everybody's like, oh yeah, just transition, totally get it. It might be something that, but it's something that we have found people understand the values, right? And in the Philippines, it was the same thing. In different sort of like segments, right, of different groups, it wasn't necessarily the primary driver. We have to ensure a just transition, but it was what is going to happen to these folks? How can we ensure equity and inclusion? What types of opportunities? Who is in the room? Who is actually represented? Is there a meaningful participation? Are we considering all sorts of potential impacts as we design and roll out programs, initiatives, policies? So we found that the spirit, right, the idea of those values are certainly recognizable, but sometimes the term as such is not quite clearly understood. So what we did in our research was to take each of those three enablers that I talked about, so policy, market, and workforce, and then adding, the lens of just transition. What does it mean in terms of just ensuring a just transition for policy? Well, we talk about in our report 4 key principles: leave no one behind, do no harm, do it better this time around, and then ensure fair distribution of cost and benefits. And this is just a way of kind of synthesizing in 4 ideas, again, a very extensive body of knowledge and research around just transition. So it doesn't mean these are like the only principles, but it was a way in which we tried to structure and talk about some of those principles to really encourage policymakers, but also people working, private sector companies, as I mentioned, innovators, and academic leaders, when we think about an educational institutions and training institutions, to think about their own work using that lens. And so in the report, we include a series of questions and, to examine, to kind of think about, oh, okay, I'm in this policy making role. What are some questions to ask ourselves and to ask of others as we're going through the process of designing policies to ensure that they align with just transition principles? And we did the same when we examined market trends, and we did the same when we looked at workforce training. So that's the idea behind just transition: is elevate those implications, make sure that we are clear on who might benefit, who might be affected by these changes, and then developing interventions and including measures to address and mitigate those impacts.
Yes, and I've got my screen frozen on the section here that talks about Michigan's Economic Transition Office. And Michigan obviously has a very, very storied history when it comes to mobility, especially automotive manufacturing. So there's been, I think it's safe to say that Michigan's been through a number of economic transitions over the decades in that regard. So I think there's probably a lot of accumulated experience with this kind of stuff. So it's interesting for this kind of work to be coming out of Michigan, from my perspective.
Yes, I mean, actually, I love that you raised that, and I think without knowing that we are actually very soon we will be publishing 2 case studies about the Michigan energy transition journey, and really looking at with the just transition lens. So that is very highly relevant. We are actually finalizing those case studies very soon. But you're 100% right. We really examined what that journey has been in the state of Michigan for the past 25 years, and how the just transition kind of concept and values have been applied throughout, right? And more recently, since 2020, with this current state government administration that has become central to Michigan's energy transition strategy. So you're right there. I think there is a lot of experience in the state, very traumatic experience too, in terms of economic and industry shifts with really catastrophic consequences for communities and workers, with plant closures, over the years and at the time of the Great Recession. And there's been a big kind of transformation here, like in Detroit, the automotive, hub, really globally during the, like in the mid-century, and for years and for decades, just being such an important hub. And now also going through that transition towards EV production. What does that mean for workers, for communities? And then in the sort of power sector, of course, there are also implications there because the state has outlined very ambitious climate goals and clean energy goals as well. So it's a really interesting mix. And you're right, we're trying to learn both and connect the experience here in Michigan to share some of those insights for decision makers in other places, understanding, of course, that the contexts are very different. But what I've come to understand also and learn is that they are very, of course, structurally very different, culturally very different. However, the impacts at the end of the day to workers and communities are very much the same, right? Your livelihood might be affected. Tax revenue is affected for your community. So what happens with plant closures? What happens in terms of communities needing economic diversification strategies and so forth? Like what should happen in terms of retraining and upskilling and other types of opportunities and strategies. So I just wanted to mention that because it's relevant. And yeah, you were right on pointing that aspect as well.
Yeah, definitely. And as a stakeholder in automotive, it's hard to like not think about Michigan as being very, very integrated and historically relevant. But then getting into this part of the world, obviously the transition towards, well, mobility is its own kind of transition. EVs are one aspect of it. I think you had an acronym for it, ACEs, right? Autonomous, Connected, Electric, and Shared. That was from a different report, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. But like you did some comparison of the different other ASEAN nations: Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia. What's your kind of assessment or overall feeling of like where, like how Philippines is on that journey relative to some of the other countries nearby?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, that was actually a really cool part of the work, and we always try to again look around and try to bring both a global and regional perspective to the work as well, because that just shows some trends, right? And so we looked specifically in terms of policy. We looked at, as you mentioned, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam, in addition to the Philippines, just to understand what types of supply or demand policies and incentives they have set forth. In recent years, really a lot of countries, not only in Asia, but around the world have, of course, momentum behind e-mobility has grown a lot. And so there is this intention of both participating in the supply chain and in EV production and manufacturing in different ways. And we find that this is the case many times, of course, when we're with countries that already have a lot of automotive manufacturing capacity, right? And regions such as in Michigan, certainly, and then Indonesia and Thailand as well, but also in countries that maybe have not had huge or automotive production capacity, but want to participate in the EV value chain. And this might be for different segments, right? 2 and 3 wheelers. It doesn't have to be only for cars. And so we see just a different experience or as I talk about, there are very many different e-mobility stories, depending on where you're standing and what you're looking at. So Southeast Asia is one of the regions where e-mobility is growing at the fastest clip. There's a lot of electrification for 2 and 3 wheelers, lots of innovation also coming out from the region. And so it's really interesting to keep tabs on what's happening. There's also the added element of critical minerals, which is an area where we're also doing some research right now, and ways in which these countries are trying to position themselves to, again, capture the opportunity that EVs bring, and also the benefits from accelerated EV adoption. And as we know, there are many of the cities in Southeast Asia that have the highest, air pollution, of course, commuting issues, all kinds of things that really lead to the need to change towards a more sustainable mobility systems. And you mentioned this, and it is something that we also highlight right away in the report, that electrification is but one tool, right? So there are many other trends you talked about, certainly for autonomous connected shared vehicles, but also in terms of transportation systems more broadly and looking at more sustainable ways to move. So that's very, very important. However, I mentioned that, and we are super keenly aware of that. But we specialize in looking at, the
The
specific
EV, right?
electrification. Exactly, the EV space. What does it mean? What are some of those implications? So that's a kind of like a long way of saying we looked at these other countries to understand how the Philippines is doing relative to that. And there's always a gap, and this is really important, of course, between what's on paper, right? And what the framework is, and then what's happening on the ground, as you know, much better than myself. And so, in terms of the Philippines, relative to these other countries that we looked at, the country has rolled out a lot of policies, incentives, and schemes related to EVs, as you yourself are very familiar with. And so we found the policy framework is very extensive. It involves a lot of different agencies and a lot of different instruments that are trying to address something specific. And other countries, again, have similar. Countries make different choices in terms of policies that, because of course they have different contexts and different structures, right? And so one of the things in the Philippines is again, there are a lot of different instruments, there are a lot of agencies involved in e-mobility. We were able to connect and interview some of the government officials that are involved at the highest levels, which was very, very helpful because they have a bird's eye view of, what they want the direction to be. We believe that the Philippines has a very important building blocks for policy already. It's still fairly early in terms of the rollout of those policies, and there are some gaps, there are some adjustments, and then there is also some of that coordination among all of the different stakeholders, which is a part that, in many contexts, it's just very difficult to achieve, like to make everything work at the same time and align that with the incentives and culture and system that exists there. And so, but with that said, we think, the takeaway of the report is, okay, there are a ton of those policies, like the key building blocks are there. The Philippines, there were some things where, I believe it was the first like EVAP, for example, it was the first EV association in Southeast Asia, actually. And there are some of the older kind of policies that were rolled out in like 2016. So there is that momentum and that direction and push for e-mobility, but it's still a pretty nascent early market. And there are some opportunities for improvement, for engaging with stakeholders, and for policy implementation that I think are going to require more time and also collaborative action.
For sure. Regarding EVAP, I think a big part of it, because a lot of those guys come out of the sort of parts manufacturing industry, so they've been, as an industry, they've been servicing automotive for a long time, and they've got lots of they've got established positions and skin in the game for that. So seeing that the direction is potentially towards, like talking back in 2016, it was not nearly as foregone a conclusion that things were going to go electric. Electric vehicles have progressed so much in these 10 years since then that I think people are like, even people that were like hating on the electric vehicles not very many years ago are now using them for rentals and stuff like that. I'm seeing it on Facebook, like people that are very, very proud of their loud motor, gas guzzler, big trucks and stuff. And they end up on a road trip and they'll use a Tesla or something from the car rental place, and they just talk about it, and they're like, I would definitely consider using this or having this as my next vehicle. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that we see, of course, in many other markets. And I think, I mean, just the technology is just getting better and better. And there's just, it's very hard to compete with the fact that it is, they are a lot more efficient, very fun to drive, all sorts of benefits that we can have, certainly with this tool. And so, and you're right, it has changed, it has evolved very fast. It will continue to do so. We're seeing certainly some uneven sort of growth because there are so many dynamics at play, right? And but policy, maybe just to kind of put a finer point on that, policy is a key lever in terms of what that sets the direction and that says, okay, these are the enabling conditions for e-mobility. And so if you don't have that, it's very hard to achieve the other things, but it has to work in concert with your market, with the workforce, which is a key enabler because you might, you will need it. You need it for production. You need it for adoption. And so you will need it. And so a big part of our research was really leading towards workforce. What are the talent needs? What should a potential EV center of excellence address in terms of that? How can it be helpful, right, to the ecosystem and to the players that are trying to move the needle here?
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. The part about the skill development, because you have an entire other report from last year about various different EV training skills development programs that you've seen across different places around the world. So would you like? I mean, as far as your whole last part of your report is about this blueprint that you're laying out, and I think that the skills development is probably the core activity. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, that is absolutely safe to say. And it kind of goes back to the origin of this collaboration. And it was very much, we're thinking about an EV Center of Excellence to focus on talent development. And based on our work in other places and some of the research you mentioned, so the EV training program, kind of like overview of different programs around the world, and also one on mobility innovation hubs. And because a lot of our chops are really in the sort of like business side of things and innovation side of things, we wanted to kind of expand that view and say, well, actually, we're going to see what the needs and potential areas or services for such a center could be, and how those could be helpful again and serve the ecosystem and support and partner with existing organizations and players. And so that's why we certainly look a lot at the talent development piece. So we were able to connect with companies both through focus groups and also via surveys to kind of understand their needs and their preferences in terms of training. What are the topics they're looking at? What are some of the main barriers? And to translate that into a potential blueprint for this EV Center of Excellence, and also expand and say, also, you could play a role in terms of strengthening the innovation ecosystem, and especially sort of orchestrating some of the other initiatives or supporting some of the existing initiatives and players as well, to be able to catalyze faster action. And so we looked at certainly training services, depending on who is your audience, because there are many different types of needs. And that's another feature of the e-mobility or the ecosystem in the Philippines. You have a lot of players at different levels with different types of drivers, motivations, and also programs in terms of EV adoption, right? So we could talk about the local government units and modernization of the public utility vehicles, or two-wheelers and three-wheelers. Like, it's just kind of different. Private cars. And so it's just very different, and the needs for training and for talent are going to vary. So depending on where you're focusing as a center, you have a series of opportunities, and you have also challenges that you need to address, right? And so it was a lot of thinking through, these are the needs, kind of like playing those back from the people who are there. These are not needs that we came up with, right? These are needs from the people who are there, who participated in our research, and then try to connect that to some sort of model that can actually lead to the best outcomes. And for that, we do kind of reach into our toolbox, into our previous research globally, to think about some of those models. And those are the other reports you talk about. So I think, in terms of takeaways, there are So very many opportunities. Again, I want to highlight there are already very strong players doing important work on e-mobility, but I do believe that there's a role for more for other players or potential entities that can sort of complement. And that's a key word, right? Complement and support and sort of add value to what's happening there and push e-mobility forward so that momentum can really sort of translate into more vehicles on the road, right? Better in terms of, okay, more electric vehicles replacing ICE vehicles, innovation and greater opportunities also for startups and innovators such as yourself to be able to, kind of like plug into the market, support some of those country goals, but also ensure that that there are the foundations there that you need, including, of course, the workforce. So that was one of the key areas that we believe, where the an EV center of excellence can really sort of make a difference.
And the EV talent development is one of 4 focus areas you mentioned. Before I get into those, I want to go back into that previous research you mentioned, especially the one about the innovation hubs, and ask you, how do you kind of think about the difference between innovation hubs and centers of excellence? Because I think you're very specific with the words you used for this particular center of excellence, while you also had last year's report about innovation hubs. So what's the difference?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think in terms of the semantics, it's what is it that we examined different types of innovation hubs in our previous report, and some didn't
Specifically,
call
mobility
themselves.
innovation hubs.
Yeah, mobility innovation hubs, I should say. Yes, absolutely. But some don't call themselves mobility innovation hubs. Some
Okay.
call themselves a hub or a center or something else. And so, but we were looking at these entities are as, we have a couple here in Michigan too. So we looked at their model to say, what is it how do you see yourself? Right? And what change are you trying to affect in the ecosystem? And so for us, Mobility Innovation Hub are those players that are trying to advance towards, more advanced mobility models specifically. And really the innovation part of it is really because we believe in, again, the role of startups and the role of innovators looking to develop different solutions that can be scaled. So if you think about that, a mobility innovation hub can serve and play many different roles for different stakeholders, right? And so we did a similar exercise. So when we think about the EV Center of Excellence in the Philippines, it can, in my view, serve as an EV innovation hub. But it also, in my view, the center of excellence to me implies a little bit more in terms of like the training part. And it could be EV technology center of excellence. That would imply to me that you're really engaged in developing the technology, maybe. Right?
Mm.
It could be a training center or center of excellence with very defined services or focus areas. So it really depends in terms of the name. Here we have a new lab, which is a mobility kind of like innovation hub, but also focuses on energy and materials along with mobility. So there are different ways of doing this. In Chile, one of the experiences we highlighted too was mobility hub, and so and they provide a completely different, definitely training, but also other services for companies, for government. The answer here is that the center of excellence, or whether it's called that or something else, should, of course, tailor, right, its services and develop the services in response to the gaps that we see in the ecosystem. And so that was the approach that we followed.
And perhaps also with an eye towards giving a pathway to people that are actually going to try to achieve excellence or obtain that kind of technical skill set or accomplishment or achievement. Striving for excellence is not something athletes, they need, like top tier athletes, like if they have access to the top trainers, the facilities, the testing and all that kind of stuff, then that can go a long way in terms of getting that higher level of performance. So perhaps
Absolutely.
that too.
Yeah.
And there's not really,
Yeah.
I don't think there's a particularly prescribed formula in terms of public versus private kind of investment. Although, like the innovation hubs around here tend to be tend to be more of like a public thing. Well, the ones that are coming out lately, the original one, I've interviewed both Jay and Jojo. They both started Launch Garage together, and like that was one of the first ones to get launched. And that is still a private innovation hub, but it's very much a software focus, like the startup, the
Yeah.
classical startup scene kind of startup.
Yeah, I understand. No, and I think you're right. But in terms of that's actually a very important point in terms of public-private. I mean, we, of course, all of our work is and mission is really focused on private sector development, but we work a lot with government because, again, policy is such a key part of the enabling environment. So we see these two as very, very important. And that, but having said that, for a model to be more sustainable, a center like this, certainly having a diversified, funding portfolio is always going to be better. And private sector engagement is very important. And we see in actually in many of the models we examine that's a crucial thing. So what do you do? How do you work with private sector? What types of partnerships can you develop to make sure that you have funding support, but also channels to connect, for example, for corporate innovation, where corporates are interested in what's happening with your startups and what they're coming up with, and there are channels for them to engage. I mean, there's a host of activities and things that such an entity can do. Now, it doesn't mean it should do all of those things either, right? It's better, and especially at the beginning, it's okay to start small and then continue to add services or focus areas as it develops. So there are many different ways of going about this. But in our research, or like to develop that blueprint, we focused on 4 key focus areas, as you mentioned. So the EV talent development, which was core one, but then activities related to strengthening the ecosystem, as I mentioned earlier, and then working on market creation, right? Which is one key thing, because you have to think about both supply, demand. How do you really create that market? What are some of those barriers? And then another area that came up during our research that was maybe more unexpected for me, at least for me, was the point around advocacy. So that's another area where a lot of the players said that it feels that there's room for additional action there in terms of, more elaborate or like fully developed policy positions or united front to kind of promote specific things or really make strides on different aspects of e-mobility. And so that's another area that perhaps it's not the center of excellence, but that another player could take on more formally, and where it seems that there will be traction. So that's how we structure the blueprint, and we're hoping we've gotten pretty positive feedback, and we're hoping that, again, the focus areas, the services, they can also inspire existing players right now to say, okay, there's demand for this. How could we address that? Or maybe this is something we can pilot and learn and kind of iterate and learn from other players what their needs are and how this works in this particular context.
Yeah. So basically, like you've got those 4 sort of core focus areas for this blueprint, and like a blueprint, like a potential center in the future. How has the response been? How would your co-conspirators what kind of feedback have you gotten from them, and what do you think they're going to do next?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been, as I mentioned, it was truly a privilege to be able to work with the Asian Development Bank transfer team. They have tremendous expertise in this sector, and so it was really, really cool to be able to work together with them. And of course, the Apple the App Foundation, they have such a history, as you mentioned, celebrity studded, and with a lot of interest in supporting development in the Philippines, and e-mobility is one of the areas they have been looking at for a while. And so we presented the research. We were working very closely together with both of these organizations, and based on that, we received very good feedback from both. I think, in terms of ADVs, really to kind of set the key part here was, what does this center look like? And is there traction and demand and interest on the part of different stakeholders in the Philippines to support such a center? And for Apple, the app, I know they were actually just recently, their executive director was recently in the Philippines having some meetings and discussions. And this research and the idea of the EV Center of Excellence is being discussed in different spheres to be able to, again, understand who could be potential supporters of this idea and what could be next steps. And so that's where we are right now. Sort of, we just launched the report. We've been having some meetings and also some feedback from some of the participants in the research, which is very, very helpful. And another very cool thing, and maybe what I love the most about my work is that I get to learn from different players in different regions. So we have partners in Africa that were really interested in the blueprint and the model for the EV Center of Excellence, and sort of also in what's happening in the Philippines. And they're eager to learn from this experience to potentially roll out or establish their own center of excellence. Again, it's not that the concept is completely new. Certainly it's not, right? And for EV innovation hubs, it's not either, but it is also not obvious what areas and how do you do it? What areas should you focus on? And how do you kind of set that foundation? Who should be involved? All of these things, right? And so it's been very gratifying to see that players in other contexts are also finding this valuable. And so that's the main goal of our work is really to make something that could be helpful and support partners' goals in other spaces as well.
Yeah, finding where some very nice lever points at this stage of the transition, and maybe some low-hanging fruit that might be available.
Exactly.
Very good to have an eye out for. So I'm gonna do the quotes part. I always do quotes at the end of the episodes. I'm gonna do this one a little bit differently. I'm only gonna present one, and it's barely a quote. But paglalayag, if you know, it means sailing or going on an expedition. It can kind of have both of those meanings. And there was this coffee table book that I became aware of in early college called The Art of Shenku. It was like maybe 300 pages in comic book form of all sorts of different interesting information, split into the physician, the traveler, the martial artist, and the sailor. And the sailor part, he had his mantra for the sailor part was movement changes circumstance, and without change there can be no improvement. So I want to ask this question of the director of mobility, because at the end of one of your reports, you talked about how the local economic development goals and the broader shared vision are the things that can really define the success of some of these initiatives and like in the long run. So how would you how do you describe mobility? Like just from that context, like what do you think Filipinos should think about in terms of what might be a good broader shared vision for mobility for the Philippines going forward?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much, Al. I love what you just that little rabbit hole you just took me into. Very cool, very cool. I love that. I love that image, and really relate to both going on an expedition and the traveler, perhaps in those images that you shared. That would be me. I love those things. Yes, and it can be metaphorically too. It's an expedition as I go set off to discover and to learn, etc. So that's really, really cool. Now, in terms of mobility and that broader vision, I mean, I love and I fell in love with mobility and the energy transition and climate considerations. Certainly for me, I think there is a really huge link, as I highlight there, to economic development. It has to make sense for each of the particular context goals. And mobility to me is really an enabler. So it's what enables everything. If you think about it, you need to go places to do really pretty much anything, right, in life. And so mobility is the enabler of that, is how you get to a certain place. How can that journey be better, be more sustainable, efficient, effective, safe, right? Really get you to the places where you need to be. And because that enables work and livelihoods and change, really, in terms of forward motion. And so it's such a key enabler of development in general. And I think it's an area where, as you said too, there are many different low-hanging fruits for things that we can improve in our own lives. but also broader implications for society, for livelihoods, for people engaged in mobility services too. So I think it should continue to be a really important fundamental right and a way in which people can really achieve their goals essentially and continue to grow towards what we're trying to achieve collectively, and that's how I see it.
Yeah, iOS is good. Are there from the just transition standpoint, are there any stakeholders that you think might be especially tricky in the Philippines, or might just need a little bit of extra like brainstorming or thinking or looking into, or yeah? Hopefully you get
I think
my gist.
Yeah, no, I think the answer there is all the stakeholders involved or that could be affected in some way, impacted in some way, should be, must be at the table in terms of discussing and sharing the concerns, and because we can read all we want, right, about, oh, this research, but it's really their experiences and what does it mean to potentially have some of your livelihood or your work at risk. In this case, how is e-mobility changing the landscape in a way that will have certainly benefits? Of course, I wouldn't be working in this space if I didn't think that there are benefits and that it's a positive thing. But we can also not be blind to the implications that are not as positive, right, for certain populations or for certain people or communities, etc. So just to see the full spectrum of needs and effects and really understand that and bring people to the table. And these might be people who work on or driving, it might be driving, jeepneys that need to be kind of like transitioning towards electric vehicles, and there are issues related to access and financing and how does this transition actually happen and what does that change management process look like. So I think it's just a lot of intentionality, and then again making sure that we're talking to and connecting and learning from the folks who are undergoing this transition, right, and seeing those effects so that we can take all of those into account. So the work remains in terms of just transition in the Philippines, but also more broadly everywhere, truly. As I mentioned earlier, we have these issues here in Michigan. It's very top of mind for government leaders that are different players engaged there. We have an economic transition office looking and supporting community and workers. And it doesn't mean it's, the work has been done, it's achieved, and it's absolutely perfect. No, it is an ongoing process, right? It is an ongoing process that needs to keep sort of evolving based on the needs and based on the progress made to date. So there's still a lot more to do. I encourage everyone to, decision makers, innovation, folks in academia, et cetera, to just think about some of those or examine some of those implications and continue to incorporate those in all of our work.
Very nice. You have a couple initiatives ongoing that some listeners may consider reaching out to you for. The first being Next Billion, and the second being your critical minerals work. So why don't you just give a bit of a rundown about those and the sorts of people who might consider reaching out?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much. So at WDI, we also host a very, very cool platform called Next Billion. So that's nextbillion.net. And it's been around for a very long time. And it is a blog, but really convenes a lot of innovators, investors, entrepreneurs, and a lot of different players working at the intersection of market and development in low and middle income countries. So it's a lot of business in emerging markets, talking about some of the challenges, talking about some of the solutions and lessons. And it is all original content that are really interesting and really fascinating discussions around trends and topics, again, around the world that are in areas, of course, including energy and e-mobility, but also all sorts of sectors. And so it's a great source of knowledge of keeping track of the latest developments. And also, we really, really enjoy working with entrepreneurs, with decision makers and leaders in this space who might want to share a story, right, on Next Billion. And so that can look as like collaborating on a specific article, sharing a specific initiative that they have that really contributes to this discourse and this dialogue. So that's one way, Next Billion, and I encourage everyone to check it out. They have a huge following, and it's a really interesting platform. And then I guess two other things. One, the case studies that I mentioned on Michigan, and that those are coming up in a couple of months, should be published, and we'll be looking to share them far and wide so that hopefully some of those insights can be helpful to folks in decision-making roles, but also in general to learn lessons from what's happening here in with regards to just transition. And last but not least is new research we're developing in the critical mineral space, and we're looking at specifically strategies for value addition for resource-rich countries. And we are learning from the experience of Chile and Ghana in terms of lithium supply chain, and then the Indonesia and the Philippines for the nickel value chain. And so we're really learning from the experience of those four countries and looking at what are some enablers and maybe barriers, but what are some of those insights as countries like these four pursue strategies to create local value added with the resources that they have. And there's a whole lot there. Of course, we find it very interesting and highly relevant to the EV value chain. Certainly, we're looking upstream a little bit more, trying to expand that lens. And in general, in addition to EVs, I mean, these minerals are also very important for the broader global energy transition. And so that will be also coming up in the next few months.
You might consider adding for the Philippines manganese and cobalt to that list. They're not huge production, but they're definitely here. So, and they're definitely on the list.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Al. And it's true for Indonesia too. They have other minerals. Chile, we're also looking at, how does that play out when a country has also other minerals and maybe more advanced strategies in these other minerals? Like, what does that mean? Does it help? Does it hinder? How is it different? So you're right. Looking at the experience for different minerals can also add a lot to that research.
I don't know if you heard my last episode, but an old running buddy of mine from Canada is now doing a podcast on deep sea mining, and he's doing his PhD on the philosophy and ethics of the resource curse and the how that's playing out in the global regulatory environment of deep sea mining. So that was my last podcast.
That is fascinating. I have not, but now I will have to. So thank you for letting me know.
Okay, well, with that, the line at Paglalayag is Tulay Lang. So keep going. Thank you very much for all your time and effort, and we'll cut her off there. So have a great night.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Al. This was fun. Thank you.
Cheers.